Hi everyone, welcome back to another video from FPL International, FPL tips for fans around the world. My name's Josh, I'm in Mauritius. Please let me know where you're from in the comments section. We love to know that we've got viewers all over the world, and we want to promote the fact that this is a global game that can be enjoyed by anyone, anywhere. Today's video is going to give you tips to build your first squad. So thinking about the start of the season, thinking about what's different, and just helping you plan for your game week 1 squad. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. We're nearing closer to that 1,000 subscribers mark, and we'd love to get there before the start of the season. You can help us do that. It's just a click for you guys, and it really means a lot to us, so we'd appreciate that. My first tip is don't get too excited about new signings. So when you've got a player coming from a Premier League club to another Premier League club, you sort of know what to expect from them in FPL. But when you've got a player who hasn't played in the Premier League, even if it's a really good player, an exciting signing, you're not exactly sure what to expect. Sometimes they can take a lot of time to settle in and even adapt to the Premier League playing style. Sometimes they're not going to play straight away. Their manager wants them to understand, how the team plays and get used to that before they do start in the first 11. And this is the same sometimes for players from the Championship, although not so extreme, I'd say. So when you've got a player coming from the Championship into the Premier League, it's not such a extreme transition. So I would say if you're going to go for a player who has not played in the Premier League before, I'd lean towards those who have been in the Championship. They're used to the English game, and there's a bit more understanding about that player and how they're going to adapt to the Premier League. My next tip is look for tips in pre-season. So there are pre-season games that will be happening soon, and just keep an eye on those. Keep an eye on how players are performing, and especially just if they're playing consistently. This is a good indicator of if they're going to be playing in the Premier League. Almost all players will play, one pre-season game at least. But those who are playing consistently are probably in their manager's long-term plans. So especially if you've got a player who's cheap, and the reason they're cheap is because we're not sure if they're going to play or not. If you see that they're getting a lot of minutes in pre-season, that's a good indicator that they might start in the Premier League games as well. And then also look for players who are playing out of position. So, the positions are already fixed in FPL, but if a defender, for example, is playing a more advanced role in pre-season, that's another, really good indicator that they could be a serious asset in FPL that season. So look out for that. But don't just base it on pre-season form. Obviously, look at their form from last season and the season before that. It's important that you have a consistent performer in your FPL team. Next tip is pick players who you know are going to get minutes. So often people are tempted to get these really cheap bench players, and it's inevitable that at some point during the season, your first 11, one of them won't play due to injury. It could be suspension. They could just not be in the manager's plans for that game. And then if you've got players on the bench who are getting 0 points, that's, you're going to have a 0 in your team, and there's nothing worse than that. So I would go for cheap players for my bench, but I would make sure that they're at least going to play, 90 minutes. So 2 points is better than 0. And then there's always the chance that, if it's a defender, they could get a clean sheet. If it's a midfielder, they could get an assist or a goal. The same for a forward. So definitely don't pick players who are not going to play just because they're cheap. It's really not worth it. My next bit of advice is really important. It's about splitting your budget and sensibly, sharing it around the squad. So in defense, usually you would go for 2 keepers who total between 8.5 and 9.5 million. So that would allow you either a cheap 4.5 keeper who's going to play every week and a 4 million keeper who's probably not going to play. But you are going to stick with that 4.5 keeper long term. Maybe throughout the whole season, you might want to make a transfer at one point during the season. You could do the same with a more expensive keeper, maybe a 5.5 million and a 4 million keeper. And one good idea is to go with a keeper from one team and then the backup keeper from that same team. So if your first keeper doesn't play for one reason or another, the backup keeper should take their place. So you're always going to have a goalkeeper who's playing. It's pretty bad when you've got two keepers who are not playing, 0 points again. And obviously there's only one substitute goalkeeper. Your defender or midfielder on the bench can't take their place. So the other option for goalkeepers is to have two goalkeepers who rotate. So they could be 4.5 million keepers, both of them. And when one plays at home, the other plays away, and vice versa. So you can always have a keeper playing at home. For defenders, look to spend somewhere between 23 and 27 million for your 5 defenders. So you should go for possibly 2 premium defenders, maybe 3 if they're not premium, these expensive 7 and 7.5 defenders. So you could manage with 3 at about 5.5 million and then 2 cheaper ones. Think about it, to be honest, during the season, you're likely to only have 3 players in defense most of the time in your starting 11. So, it's not worth wasting money spending 5 or 5.5 million on a defender who's going to be on the bench most of the time. So think about that. But like I mentioned earlier, have a defender on the bench who is going to start, just so you've got that to fall back on in case one of your first 11 doesn't get any points. Okay, on to the midfielders. This is where you want to spend a lot of your budget. So somewhere between 40 and 47 million on your 5 midfielders. This is because midfielders are the highest scoring players in the game, generally. I think the last 7 seasons or so, the highest scoring player has been a midfielder. And on average, midfielders score more points than any other position. So I would go with 2 premium midfielders. This is because it's good to have a captain to pick each week. But then if that captain is not going to play or has a really tough game, you can fall back on the other one. So a couple of really expensive midfielders, and then the others just sort of like gradually getting cheaper. So somewhere in the middle, sort of like a upper mid-priced, a lower mid-priced, and a budget midfielder. It's good to have different midfielders at different prices. This is going to help you with transfers later in the season. So if all your players, for example, are around 7.5 million in midfield, and you want to get in a premium midfielder, it's difficult to do that. You take out one midfielder, you've only got 7 or 8 million to spend. You have to take out 2 and then get a more expensive one and a cheaper one. And it's just a waste of a transfer. So try and have midfielders at different price points. This shouldn't be your priority, but it's just something that will help you later in the season. And then your forwards, you want to spend between 20 and 27 million. It all depends on what money you've spent elsewhere. So if you're spending more in midfield, you're going to have to make a sacrifice and spend a bit less upfront. That's how FPL works. So I would go with either a premium forward, a mid-price forward, and a budget forward, or just 3 mid-priced. You can get very good value on some mid-priced forwards, especially those who are going to play week in, week out for their team. So like I mentioned, sometimes you do have to make a sacrifice. You may be able to spend a bit more upfront, but in midfield or defense, you'd have to cut back on your expenditure. So it's up to you, but my main tip would be to spend a bit more in midfield. Those are the players that score more points, and you're likely to want to have 4 or 5 of those midfielders in your first 11 each week. So I would spend a bit more there and look for the budget options elsewhere. My next tip, don't get excited about players and just get them in before you've looked at their fixtures, especially at the beginning of the season. This is a good time to really spend time looking at the fixtures, thinking about who's going to score well, defenders that are going to keep clean sheets, forwards who are going to score, midfielders who are going to be allowed to be creative. So look carefully, especially at the fixture difficulty rating. So you'll notice that fixtures usually have a difficult rating of between 2 and 5. Sometimes it's color coded. And this is going to help you to look at teams who have favorable fixtures and maybe target the players from those teams. don't concentrate just on this, because after the first 5 or 6 games that you're focusing on, things can change. So you do have to go for players who are going to be consistent throughout the season, but maybe a few different players who other FPL managers won't have because of their fixtures, and that can get you points where others are not getting them. Finally, don't worry. Don't take too many risks and think you have to do something different at the beginning of the season. You've always got a chance to use your wildcard, and a lot of FPL managers use their wildcard quite early on when they've seen new players, players from the promoted teams, just players who are having a good season compared to others. So sometimes game week 4 or beyond is a good time to use your wildcard, sometimes during the international break, or sometimes when the fixtures look like they're going to swing, and a couple of teams who had easy fixtures are then having difficult fixtures, and then other teams who have had a tough opening few fixtures, their fixtures are then becoming easier. So that's a good time to use your wildcard as well. So don't worry, you've always got that wildcard to change your team if you need to. And it's always exciting using your wildcard once you know the form of some of these players and just the form of some of the teams and a few things that are happening that no one expected at the beginning of the season. Okay, those are my tips for making your first squad. I hope it's been useful. If you like this video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe. We're getting close to 1,000 subscribers now, and we want to get there before game week 1. You can help us do that. We'd really appreciate that. Okay, I'll be back with another video soon, but for now, stay safe.